Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this very special bonus episode with a guest we've had in the recent past, Dan Vacanti. Hi, Dan. Welcome back.
Vasco, thanks so much for having me back so quickly. I mean, this is a highlight of my month.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a pleasure. We talked about data last time, and we kind of teased that we would be talking a lot more about data in a future episode, which is today's episode. We will be talking about the psychology of communicating data. But first, a little bit about Dan. Dan is a 20 plus years software industry veteran who spent most of the last years focusing on Lean and Agile practices. In 2007, he helped to develop the Kanban Method for knowledge work, and he also co-founded ActionableAgile, which provides industry-leading predictive analytic tools, and services to any Lean and Agile process company. Dan also co-founded the prokanban.org, a community-focused initiative, to help people learn more about Kanban. Of course, that is an important piece of background because in the Kanban community, you guys have been pioneering the use of data a lot within the Agile brother community. So that's also important for today's episode. We're probably going to talk about Kanban as well. And we're probably also going to talk about no estimates, which was the topic of our last episode. And you can listen to that episode. The link is in the show notes. This episode, however, we are talking about the psychology of using and communicating data, a key feature, of course, of all estimation and no estimation related processes. So let's start with context first, though, Dan. What are, in your mind, the challenges that we must be aware of when we use and communicate data, not only about estimates, but data in general?
I'll shy away from the estimate side of things. I'll let you maybe address that. I'll talk more to like the actual real data that we're collecting. Like so many of the questions that you asked, Vasco, I think there's several answers and several layers to it. One of the biggest pitfalls to start out when you're communicating using data is assuming that people understand the data that you're presenting them. Most people have, if they've been trained at all, most people have been trained incorrectly, in my humble opinion anyway, to assess and analyze data. That's kind of the first things. They're going to do things like, distill it down into easily consumable chunks and start talking about things
like a single number very often.
A single number, yeah. I would start talking about things like averages and stuff like that. So, and when we talk about forecasting, average is kind of killer. So to me, that's number one. But probably even more important that even if they do understand what they're looking at, the biggest pitfall for me by far when presenting data to people is assuming that they will respond rationally when presented with that data. And I think that kind of gets to the crux of what we're going to be talking about today is most people think, oh yeah, we've got this data in black and white and here it is. It's hard fact, it's truth, and people will respond rationally. And for the most part, they don't. People don't respond rationally. In fact, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, Todd Miller, and we were talking about how a lot of times people behave more irrationally when presented with actual evidence. So
let's dive into that a little bit, though, because I think I know what you mean, but I, of course, want to double check when you say people don't react rationally. Now, a friend of mine would say that whenever a person reacts, there's many systems at play, right? Like there's the emotional part, obviously, we all recognize that. And there's quite a lot of research and investigation on the fact that emotions are inseparable of how we act on anything. And there's also the perspective side, right? Like I have one perspective on a number, you have another perspective on a number. There's that old adage of the glass half full. Well, for somebody else, it's half empty, right? So what do you actually mean precisely, Dan, when you say that people react irrationally when presented with data?
You can have a conversation about appropriate interventions based on what the data is telling us. There's the classic project management stuff like, cut scope or, add people or, change the date. But more often, which I would argue, I would maybe pitch those more as kind of the rational. But more often it's like, let's do a death march, let's cancel overtime, let's cancel holidays, let's or
let's just try harder.
Yeah, or the numbers are wrong. I don't believe the numbers, and so I'm going to kind of do my own thing. So
I don't know. Maybe I'm going on a limb here in saying that maybe a feature of an irrational reaction to data is the reaction that is built on the assumption that we know what it means. Meaning that if I say, hey, the project is late, very likely this happened to me, right? I'm talking to a program manager. We're 6 months into a 12-month project. And I say, hey, we're going to be 6 months late, at least, probably more. And a rational type of reaction in my mind would be, oh, interesting. What data did you collect and why did you come to that conclusion? That would be a rational reaction, right? Like, trying to analyze, is this data credible? Where is it coming from? How did you interpret it? And so on. An irrational reaction could be either you're crazy, that's not possible, or even you're absolutely right, let's panic immediately, right? So what I mean by this is, maybe one way to describe a rational reaction to data might be that instead of taking an action, like reacting immediately, we first try to analyze what the data means. Where is it coming from? Is there counter data? Like, is all data pointing in the same direction, or are there other data pointing in another direction? And specifically in project management, this is very important because you never know the future. You only have the data you have in front of you, right? How do you see it? What would be a rational reaction to data?
We have to be a little bit careful. I mean, I certainly take your point, but most of my efforts for the past several years have been focused on. Well, let me take a step back because you make a really good point. I think that most people need to understand is in any data set, there is going to be both noise and there's going to be signal, right? And I think kind of what you're getting at is trying to understand, what is that signal? Can we separate the signal from the noise? What is that signal, and what is that signal telling us? Because if we're responding to noise, we're going to make things worse. If we don't respond to signal, we're going to make things worse. To me, that's kind of key. The reason I say that is because most of my efforts for the past several years have been trying to understand how do we get that signal as early as possible. Because it's not so much that I want that signal early so we can panic. It's I want that signal early so that we can take appropriate action, so that any action that we do take can have some impact. And so that's why, yes, I think it's reasonable that, we can collect some data and we need to take a step back and understand, okay, do we really understand what it's telling us? Do we have the full picture? I'm hoping, and there's one metric that I think I can point people to that kind of gets us down this path. But I'm hoping that there's data that we can look at that is like, this really is signaling something, and intervention is warranted immediately, if not very soon. So I don't know if that addresses what you were talking about, but I want to make sure, yes, hopefully cool heads prevail. But if we do get a clear, unambiguous signal, that should be impetus to act and probably act quickly.
And I think that's a very important caveat, right? If we have a clear signal, there's a psychological dynamic that I'd like to get your take on. So this is something that I'm sure all of our listeners have seen happening in front of them. I've observed that very often in multi-team environments, there's an implicit incentive to hide data, to hide information, to hide the signal. And we know that, and Agile tried to get rid of it by saying that only running software is a demonstration of progress, right? Or evidence of progress. Very often in projects, it's actually a PowerPoint saying that everything is green until it's not, right? So there's this implicit incentive to hide information about the project or the delivery being late. And this leads to this too late to do anything phenomenon, right? Whereby the first team that communicates that they are late is blamed. So everybody hides that until it's too late to do anything and then of course, when the first team says, sorry, by the way, we're not going to be able to deliver, the panic level is so high that we focus on, making people work overtime and so on. And all the other teams are excused, even though they were also late, but nobody's focusing on that. Have you observed that kind of dynamic, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course, and you know me, I have thoughts. I have an opinion on everything. So, but as before, I think there are several dimensions at play here. So yes, absolutely have seen that. First, I think there's an element of shame people don't want to look bad. I mean, getting back to the psychology of these things, everybody wants to be the hero of their own story. And the last thing they want to do is tell a story where it paints a light that they failed. So I think there's an element of shame. There's also an element of fear that you brought up, because anybody who puts their head above the parapet, that's what's going to get blown off. Nobody wants to take that blame, and nobody wants to have any repercussions for communicating late. But I think a big dimension of it that maybe doesn't get talked about as much, at least maybe not that I've heard, again, gets back to this psychology and rationality of things, is I think a lot of times people think, well, I know that the data tells us we're going to be late, but we can still get it done. There's this element of hope. There's this element of
optimism,
yeah. And we can pull together and everything's going to be okay. People are these eternal optimists. And again, to me, it sounds harsh, but I think that's an irrational strategy. What do you think about any of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely shame is there. And obviously there's the fear of the condemnation that comes with that. And also the element of optimism is actually rather strong. I mean, one of the first things that I learned about estimation, and I am going to bring it up because, of course, it's one of the few areas where we have concrete, hard data to look at, even though we try to avoid it very hard in the software field. When we look at the estimates, people, even faced with data, they will come up with narratives, and this is the key word here, narratives. We're talking about psychology, right? So they come up with narratives whereby the past was slower than the future. We will always be faster in the future. Of course, this is optimism. Of course, this is kind of trying to hide things that might be problems, but they are not talking about them. And obviously, it's also an element of ignoring the data. And one of the things that I've tried to put forward with the work that I've done in No Estimates is that the world could be worse than what the data tells you. And it's better for you to be prepared for that than and then the world being better than what the data tells you, right? Like a positive surprise, then you not being prepared and then you having a negative surprise, right? So we also need to bring into the conversation, and maybe we could talk about that a little bit further and your experience on it. We need to bring to the conversation the aspects related to risk management, right? So talking about risk and the consequences versus the actions that we can take.
I was just about to interrupt you and say, hey, we need to talk about risk management. This is something I think we spent a bit of time on in the last episode. That's kind of the next key thing, I think. So before I talked about how all data has noise, some data has signals. That's kind of the first thing. The next thing from that, if you believe that, then kind of, to me, the next step along there is if we can separate the signal from the noise, what's the probability, of certain events happening? What are appropriate mitigations? What are appropriate risk reduction strategies? What are appropriate, whatever, based on that? Because the data is never going to be clear, 100% this is what's going to happen, or 0% this is what's going to happen. The data will never come out that way. We do not live in a deterministic world, which means we have to start taking a probabilistic approach, which kind of brings us full circle to what I was saying about before, is when you start presenting probabilities to people, their eyes kind of glaze over because most people don't understand probabilistic thinking. I say this all the time too. I'm not even sure that I understand probabilistic thinking.
I like this topic, and I wanted to go a little bit deeper and explore some examples of things that probabilities tell you and things that probabilities don't tell you. So you've already said one, right? Like knowing the probability of an event does not tell you whether the event will happen.
Exactly.
Right. And there's another problem, a problem that I've seen very often, even from the probability friendly crowd, which is this illusion that knowing the probability of a delivery date means it will happen, meaning that there's a 90% probability of delivering before December 25th, the Christmas problem, as we usually talk about. Well, that doesn't mean that you're likely going to deliver before December 25th. It means that if you did 100 projects, 95 of those would be delivered before the 25th of December. So this concept of probability is not applying to single events, and therefore the kinds of probabilities that we talk about are actually not useful for decision making, right? Not all. Like there are probabilities that are useful for decision making, but the probability of a release date is not one of them.
I think we'd have to talk about that a little bit more. certainly the idea, understanding probability doesn't necessarily mean an event will or will not happen. My favorite example of this, I don't know if it's everybody else's favorite example of this, is the 2016 US presidential election. Going into that, everybody had Trump at about a 25% chance of winning. Yet we all know what happened in that election. And the immediate reaction to that was, oh, well, the pundits got it wrong, the statisticians got it wrong, everybody got it wrong, how could Trump get elected when he only had a 25%? And the thing is, 20% is not zero. I mean, it's that he to your point, every 4 elections, Trump's going to win one of those.
Yeah, if his chances are 25%. Exactly. And this is why, for example, one of the things that you work on, which I think is important for us to highlight, is using data to provide Monte Carlo simulation for project decision making. And one of the things that is very important is that data needs to be related to multiple events during the project. It cannot be related only to one single event. Like one way that I describe this when I'm asked is, it's perfectly okay to forecast the delivery date of many stories over time and through that create a Monte Carlo simulation of when the project might be delivered. But it's the stories that you're simulating, not the project, because the project only happens once, right? And just like the election, 25% means, every 4 elections he's going to be elected. It doesn't mean that he's not likely to be elected.
Correct. I mean, this potentially gets us a little bit off topic, so we can cut it. But the question I'd want to ask, and then maybe we come back to what we're talking about, is when we do get that outcome that wasn't what we were expecting, for example, Trump winning the 2016 election, and again, I think you were hinting to this. The question we need to ask is, number one, did we just get unlucky, or lucky, depending on what your political persuasion is, right? Did we get unlucky or did we get lucky? But to me, a more important question to ask is, was our model right or wrong? It's possible we got the wrong answer with the right model, or the right answer with the wrong model. Separating out those two things, I think, is really, really hard. And to your point, especially with long running projects where you only get that one outcome, going back and doing that analysis, well, okay, what was it? Was it how we forecasted that was wrong? Did we just get unlucky? What happened? I don't have a good answer to that, to be honest with you.
I think we need to bring that back to that idea that, okay, we are dealing with people, right? We're talking about social dynamics, right? So one problem we have with data is the Heisenberg principle of decision making, right? The moment you start measuring, you've already affected the kind of decisions that are possible, right? So we don't know what generates what, but we know that there's a social dynamic happening. We talked about shame and optimism and so on that comes with it. And what I'm thinking, and this is what I've been trying to kind of put forward in the work that I've done also on No Estimates, is that data should be there to enable decision making. And of course, then we need to have the heuristics that we put on top of that data, right? Like a very common example that I use is a football player, so a European football player, trying to hit the ball with his left foot, let's say he's left-footed, while the ball is in the air coming towards him and he's running forward to get into a position where he can score. Like, there's so many things that could be different than what the player expects. So they don't do physics calculations, right? They don't do, the projectile equations on their head. They're looking at the ball and they're running at the same time. And here's the key. The players that succeed at that kind of trick, they are very often, most of the time, looking at the ball, not necessarily at the terrain or the position. They already have the terrain and the position in their minds, and they're looking at the ball in order to be able to use the eye coordination heuristic, right? You're always looking at the target, you move towards the right place, and then you execute the kick. If a defender comes in and interferes that, the attacker is likely to miss the shot, because now the attacker needs to take another variable into account and therefore lost sight of the goal. And when I bring that back to project management, and this is what I use in No Estimates, is the goal is to release on a certain date. Deadlines exist, whether because you run out of money or Christmas is coming, whatever there is, or even there's no patience to go later than that, whatever the reason is, there's a deadline for almost everything. So if we keep the eye on the deadline and we constantly manage scope using good agile practices like continuous delivery and deployment, et cetera, if we keep the eye on the ball and continuously move forward and manage scope towards that, we have a chance of delivering on time, right? And this, for me, brings back the importance of understanding what data is there to do for us, right? Data is there to kind of put a little bit of structure into a heuristic that we already have in place.
Yeah. A lot of people like to talk about data-driven decisions and things like that. I kind of more like to what you're saying. I kind of more like the phrase data-informed, because at the end of the day, it is humans making decisions. And context, people say context is king. I like to say context is queen. The data have no meaning, apart from their context. And the data won't tell you the context. It's up for the human's interpretation of that context and what does that data mean in that context. To be sure. So I guess I'm in violent agreement with you. I don't know that I really have.
So maybe one way to phrase this, and let me know if you agree, is that when we use data, we need to recognize that data is context agnostic. The context is always brought in by the people who are looking at the data.
Correct. And this is that synthesis that you're talking about there is where it really becomes more art than science. People think data collection and analysis is a hard science, and it's not, because understanding the context under which that data was collected is huge. And there's always going to be a bias. There's always going to be something from the person who is analyzing the data. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we just need to recognize that we can't just throw data up on a chart somewhere and expect us to tell us everything that we need to know. That's really not how it works.
So I think that from a point of view of the Scrum Masters, we also need to help our friends out there, maybe struggling to communicate a message using data to their peers and their managers and their stakeholders. What are some of the advice that you can share that you've learned over the years that can be useful to take into account when communicating data? Now, I'm not advocating here that we should use data for a particular outcome, because of course that's also a possibility. I mean, we are talking about our own opinions as well, but rather to communicate data to help decision makers, right? Like, so I'm assuming we're, as Scrum Masters, we're not actually making the decisions. We're creating, maybe even helping to collect data to help create the necessary information that decision makers need in order to make a decision. So from that perspective, what are some of the advice that you would like to share?
The hardest lesson I learned, and I learned it very, very early on, but I don't know that I've still done a good job of figuring it out, is people are always going to run to some type of tool, whether it's story points, whether it's cycle time, whether it's Monte Carlo simulation, whatever it is. They're always going to want to run to some type of tool when presenting data. And for me, presentation of data has never been a tooling problem. It's always been an education problem. That's where I would start. I mean, there has to be some type of education. It would seem strange, especially if you're talking to upper management or executives or whatever. But there has to be some type of education of this stuff, because I can go collect a lot of flow metrics and I can present pretty charts with cycle time and throughput, and I can show a Monte Carlo analysis, and I can do all this stuff. But if they don't know what they're looking at, it's going to be meaningless. And then now all this other stuff, the psychology of it, kind of really jumps in, that we've talked about before.
So where should we go if we want to learn more about how to help others be more, I would say, deliberate about how they look at and use data in their decision making?
I can share some of my favorite authors on this, where I've gone. I don't know if that's what you necessarily mean, but okay. but I'm a geek. I'm a nerd. I don't know that people should necessarily follow what I do.
Now, of course, people can follow you, and we'll give everybody the links to find you on social media and your website and so on to get a distilled version of it. But there are some geeks here in the audience, so let's go for it.
For me, the person who really brought rigor to this concept that we've been talking about this is a guy by the name of Walter Shewhart. I don't know if anybody knows who Shewhart is. If you don't know who Shewhart is, you should, because Shewhart was Deming's mentor. Everybody in Lean talks about Deming, and they should, because Deming was brilliant. But Shewhart taught Deming everything that Deming knows about data. And so I went back to the original. I go back and I read the original Shewhart. His writing is not as accessible as Deming. I think that's why Deming is so popular. And I would read Deming. I'd read a lot on Deming. Contemporary authors on this topic would be a guy by the name of Dr. Donald Wheeler as well, Wheeler. But then there are people like Don Reinertsen, who, as far as I'm concerned, in current times, his thinking on this topic is is second to none. So
yeah, and I think that the reference to Donald is very important here, Don Reinertsen. I mean, especially because he brought a model with him that helps to clarify some of the signal out of all the data that we might be collecting, right? Like, so the whole concept of the cost of delay is a very good, I would say, complicated concept, but it's a concept that brings a model with it that helps us to distill some of the implications that the data have. This is especially useful, of course, for companies that develop software as their main occupation, as well as continuously develop software. If you do one-off projects only, there's still a lot to learn, but maybe other parts, not necessarily the cost of delay. But definitely, one of the things that I would like to highlight here is that the authors that you mentioned, some of them are more or less accessible. For me, Don's book, the original book, I think from the 90s, I forget the name right now, was much more easy to read than the second generation Flow, which is a collection of principles, more like a textbook, if you will, to be used in a university course. So I'll put the link on the show notes so that people can easily find it as well. And one of the things that we talked about, like the psychology of using data is not easy, but it can also work in our favor. So one of the things we talked about already was risk management. And what I learned in my own experience is that if you use data in order to justify the existence of a risk, rather than to push a solution or a decision, you're more likely to get a sympathetic ear, because everybody wants to solve risks, but not everybody thinks they should be solved the same way you do, right?
Yes, I know you want me to. I don't know if you want me to add something to that. I kind of want to add on to that. I mean, like I said, I don't have anything necessarily to add directly to that because I totally agree. But one heuristic, if you will, that I like to follow when we're talking about handling risk or ways to handle risk is, so many times I see in agile projects specifically that people want to take on long-term risk for short-term gain. And for me, it should be the complete opposite. We should be taking on short-term risk for long-term gain. That was the whole point of Scrum. Is the way that I read Scrum. That was as a reaction to Waterfall. Waterfall was taking on all kinds of risk all over the place. And Scrum comes along and says, you know what, we should probably limit our risk to less than a month and probably much less than that. And let's try and contain our risk for the next couple of weeks and see what happens. Hopefully that will buy us much better gains in the long term. And it surprises me. It seems like most agilists out there kind of get that backward, because they think it's more about let's cut corners in order to get this release out. Let's start too much work in progress, from a Kanban, from a flow perspective. Let's start too much work in progress, because of course the sooner we start something, the sooner we'll finish something. And they're taking on all this risk and they don't even know it, and it's a bunch of long-term risk to try and get those short-term gains.
Yeah, I think that's a great heuristic, something that I'm sure will help many of our friends out there. It's better to take short-term risk, typically small risk, like one iteration, because long-term risk is usually big risk, like a big bang release or a rewriting of a platform. I mean, don't just get me started on the rewriting anti-pattern in software. That would be a whole another episode, so let's skip that. But I think kind of in summary, in my mind, we talked about the psychology of using data, but we referred to, and we just ended up again talking about the fact that a lot of what the job that data needs to perform is to inform risk assessment and therefore also decisions related to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's job number one and job number all of it. I don't. That's really what. You can't look at data. Like I said, you can't necessarily look at data and assume the data is going to tell you what to do or what not to do. That's unfortunately not how it works. And the sooner that we can get to a point where we're embracing that uncertainty rather than rejecting that uncertainty, but embracing that uncertainty, it opens up all kinds of different avenues for us in terms of how we might go about managing our projects, our products.
Yeah, and that's a very good point as well, embracing uncertainty. Dan, it's been a pleasure. I mean, this was just the start of the conversation. I feel we could be on, we could have this talk over dinner, a few glasses of good wine, and I think we wouldn't run out of topics to converse. It's been a pleasure. So before you go, tell us, where can we find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
If anybody wants to go to the prokanban.org website, it's just literally prokanban, prokanban.org. Go to the website and you can see what we're doing there. I got a couple of books published. If you want to check me out on LeanPub or Amazon. I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn sporadically, but I'm usually just complaining about tennis, although Nadal has been having a great year this year. So not much to complain about there. But yeah, I mean, and Drunk Agile podcast, which I think we talked about last time, that we would love to have you on, Vasco, if you're up for it sometime soon. Check us out, Drunk Agile on YouTube. Would love to see all of you there, and you specifically, Vasco.
Absolutely. So the challenge is accepted. So whenever you're ready, I'll be ready. Once again, Dan, thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
No, thank you for the invitation. I enjoy this. I hope we get to do it again very, very soon. These are conversations I always look forward to. So can't wait to do it again.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.